trying to get my timings right here, so I was, Anthony. So, good afternoon, everyone. Philip McDonough's just said to me, are you up here again? So apologies that you have to put up with me again. It's great to see you all here again this afternoon. And I just wanted to start off by acknowledging the Northwest Tertiary Education Programme, who are sponsors of this session this afternoon. And we're actually going to run a short film for the sponsors just to begin the session. Thank you. I'm going to start just by introducing the speakers, and there's a bio of them, so in terms of just some background, so I'll just introduce your names if that's okay. So we have Peter Osborne, who's the chair of the Integrated Education Fund, Dr. Orla Flynn, who's president of Atlantic Technology University, Kyra Reynolds, who's a development worker with Peace Barriers Programme, and Joel Keys, who's an activist. So we've got a really different panel this afternoon in terms of a mixture between kind of community and education, and some very good views. I think that we'll hopefully get the conversation going well. So I'm going to begin with just some questions for the panel, and then hopefully we'll move on to some questions as well from the audience in a while. But just Orla, I was just going to ask you, in terms of the formation of the ATU and the potential for the Northwest region, could you say just a little bit about how you came about?
Thanks very much, Maureen. And firstly, just to say how glad I am to be here. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I look forward to a lot more engagement with yourselves in the years ahead. So Atlantic Technological University was established on the 1st of April 2022 under the Technological Universities Act passed in 2018. And that act really saw the coming together, the merging of the former institutes of technology around the country and coming together to form technological universities. Atlantic Technological University was formed from the merger of Letterkenny Institute of Technology, which had two campuses in Letterkenny and Killybegs, Institute of Technology Sligo, and Galway Mayo Institute of Technology, which had campuses in Mayo, in Castlebar, and four campuses in Galway, one in Connemara, in Letterfrack, the Furniture College, one in Montbellew in the east, where we've agricultural, it's the Agricultural College, and two in Galway City. And on the 1st of November, St. Angela's College is going to join us as well. So you might ask, well, why did you do that? And the rationale for that was to try and harness the strengths that we have across all three of those institutes, get people working together to drive prosperity in the northern and western region. So I think any of us on our own didn't have that wide regional reach, but together our campuses overlap very closely with the northern and western region. And we have a very strong border presence. You know, we interact very well across border. We have a lot of Gaeltacht presence, a lot of the islands. It's a very, very unique region in Ireland. So we're a year and a bit in now, and so that's what we're about. And again, it's about bringing people together, getting them working together, getting the whole university behind any initiatives that we're involved in.
It's been a bit of it has been interesting to watch the departure from, the Institutes of Technology in the south of Ireland compared to what's happened in the north, in terms of, so what would be your observations just around the differences between the two now and what their aspirations are?
Well, typically the regional technical colleges, which would have been the kind of origin institutes before they became Institutes of Technology, typically they would have had a remit to serve the needs of the region. Big focus on technical and practice-focused education, big focus on industry and involvement with industry and involvement of industry in our regional technical colleges. And that focus hasn't changed a whole lot. What has happened is that industry has become more sophisticated, and our ability to serve industry and serve the needs of the region then has had to evolve. And we continue to have that practice-based focus, and we continue to work really closely with industry. Where we need to see a big step change is in the research space. We are active in research. We offer PhDs for a good number of years now, but we need to see that intensifying. And the collaboration with partners in the north is going to be a real part of that. We have a very strong relationship with Ulster University. We have some joint programs with UU. And we have an overall memorandum of understanding. I'm looking down at Malachy there now. That's another one on the to-do list. But we have a memorandum of understanding, particularly with UU, because we do share a very strong possible relationship there. And then the Northwest Tertiary Education Cluster and my thanks to the NW Tertiary Education Cluster for supporting this session. And what that tries to do is it tries to ensure that further education and higher education are actually working even more closely together. And many of the benefits of further education would be that you have people who maybe don't feel that they're ready to go on to university, or people who have full-time caring or other responsibilities, or people who may feel that they missed out in primary and second level education. And it's often a chance for them to get back into education, pick up very practical orientated skills, but also gain confidence that they can succeed as learners. So the relationship between further and higher education is one that is very strong in the Republic, and delighted to see the Northwest Tertiary Education Cluster involving ATU, Ulster University, the Northwest Regional College, and Donegal Education and Training Board.
Could I ask, what does that mean practically when you talk about engagement with, say, Ulster University? From a practical perspective, what does that mean in terms of the engagement with students, presumably?
So practically, I mentioned we have a couple of joint awards already. So there's a joint award in the management area for public sector. There's a joint award in the area of biomedical science. And we're also collaborating in the research space. So we have quite a few projects in the research area. Some of them have been funded through cross-border funding initiatives. And we're talking about collaborating in around joint professorships as well. And the collaborations with the Northwest Tertiary Education Cluster, I hope, will see us working together with industry, looking to support industry through perhaps a joint combined approach. So if there are particular skill sets that industry needs, perhaps we can work together to ensure that those skills are made available, combining forces with what's available in UU and what's available in ATU. It's about us putting our region first and working together to serve the needs of the region. The work with the further education space is equally important, because it's about nurturing those pathways into higher education. Typically where you have strong research centers and we have strong activities, those kind of regions are very attractive to industry. They support startups, they support emerging SMEs, and they also are a kind of a magnet for foreign direct investment as well. So harnessing our collective strengths, working together to nurture skills pathways right up through the further education and the Northwest Regional College, Donegal ETB, and ensuring that there are pathways into higher education, on into postgraduate and research activity. All of that will support a kind of an economic benefit for the wider Northwest region.
It's kind of trying to build a cluster.
Absolutely,
Effect.
absolutely.
What would be the biggest challenges you face trying to do that?
Oh, well, there's lots of challenges, really. I mean, the establishment of the Northwest Tertiary Education Cluster, so we've had landscape funding from the Higher Education Authority in Ireland, and some of that funding has gone to support the Northwest Tertiary Education Cluster, and obviously there's been some shared island support for that as well. We'd really like to see that put on a more permanent basis, because I think that there would be a huge amount of goodwill internationally to support that kind of an agenda, because ultimately, I think when people have well-paid jobs and meaningful work, it just means that the community is better able to thrive, and that's something I think that we'd all probably agree on. But ensuring that we hang on to people in the region is going to be very important. I think the Northwest region probably has some of the highest percentages. Donegal and Derry in particular have very high percentages, the highest certainly in the Republic and in Northern Ireland, of people who have at most primary school education. And what that means is that those who have gone on to achieve higher levels of education, often they have left the region. You know, from Donegal they might have gone to Galway, or they've gone to Dublin, or they've emigrated. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that we have opportunity for people to stay in our regions, and that there's really good opportunities for them in the workplace.
It's interesting because I know piece of work, and we spoke about him doing for the Shared Island Unit on cross-border workers, and the importance of the education system, and the flow between the education systems in terms of encouraging people to think about studying in both, in either jurisdiction, and the knock-on effect that would have in terms of then the potential for employment opportunities as well. So again, it's just that connectivity between everything is key.
And I suppose one of the other things, we are very anxious to keep our Northern Ireland partners in the Horizon Europe research funding area, and the ability to include Ulster and Queens in those big research activities and avail of European funding is something that we're obviously delighted that's part of the landscape, and continues to be part of the landscape, because that's going to be particularly important for us as a new university, even though we've 50 years of history, but we are going to be making a step change. We're going to be investing significantly in research across the entire Northwest region, and our ability then to work closely with you in particular, because they're such close neighbours, but also in Queens, and continue to be involved in those research projects. I think that's going to be very important for the region.
It was great to see that announcement on Horizon. I think it's a really great step.
A big lift, yeah, for sure.
There. So, Kyra, I was going to move on to you in terms of a very different but important perspective on the whole idea of cross-border community working, and I know that's something you're very active in. What do you think is missing from that? The whole kind of concept of cross-border community activity.
Yeah, I'm going to apologise because I'm very nervous. So if I stutter, that's why.
Just get there. So
yeah, okay.
We're just having a chat.
Yeah, so I come at it from a very different angle. As a community worker, I do peace building work and an interface in Derry. For me, what's missing is it's okay, to have these projects like fixing up the A5 so that there's increased transport between two areas, but the reality is that 2/3 of people in the Republic don't have any connections north of the border, and they have 80% haven't been across the border in the last 5 years. So we might have practically the means of getting there, and it might be good to cooperate on things like health research and things like that, and that's extremely important. But to give you an example, what about the small people? what about the person, for example, we're doing a cross-border program at the minute, funded by International Fund for Ireland, and it's called Better Together. And it's a very grassroots program where we're trying to build the capacity of community organisations in the border region using our experiences in the north. But as part of that, we work with the Pink Ladies Cancer Support Group. And recently they had their annual conference, but they held it in the Inishowen Gateway this year. So there was this one woman that came in off her own bat, and I was sitting beside her, and I was like, oh, what's your interest in this? And she was like, I am currently getting treatment, and I drive to Altnagelvin and back again. Now, this was an elderly woman who was getting cancer treatment, and I was like, oh, well, how's it going? And it turned out that she was terminal. And I was just devastated to hear that she was driving herself to Altnagelvin and back again because there was no like transport arrangements for people going that way towards Altnagelvin, whereas my brother passed away 4 years ago with cancer, and I know personally that he was offered the service of getting the transport and going back again. So what about those people? What about the small people? Like, it's all well and good doing, the sort of, the all-Ireland initiative for palliative care and all that there, but is that filtering down? And another thing I think is missing, I was at an event last night, and it was supposed to be about, Protestant identity in a shared island. And, hats off to, it was actually Sinn Féin that organised the event, and hats off to them for doing that. But at the end, I was so disappointed that the questions that were coming from the audience, that was largely Nationalist Republican, for the all-female Protestant Unionist panel was, well, are you willing to have the discussions? And I really thought the answer was well telling, because they were like, yes, we're here, we're willing to have the discussions, but, and they looked at Derry as like a microcosm of, what it would be like if we had a united Ireland or shared Ireland or whatever. And they were like, we have 8 representatives in the council in Derry Strabane from our community out of 40-something. They don't feel like their voice is being heard. Most of the decisions being made locally are for a community that is not theirs. And they gave the example of the King's coronation, and there was no funding available from council for that. And they were like, well, where do we get to have our voice heard? So practically, if we can't even get it right in Derry, locally, why are we having a conversation about, a united Ireland and the constitutional question? Another thing that's missing too, I think is overlooked, is the South doesn't really know that much about what goes on in the North. I was having a conversation with somebody this morning, actually, before coming into this room, and they were saying that there does seem to be a lot of ignorance in the South as to what the North has faced, and that, sometimes people would think, well, why would one side do that if they know it's going to annoy the other side? But, like, Northern Ireland, unfortunately, is just a wee place that doesn't operate in common sense. And I think, it really doesn't. And I think whenever you, whenever you see something like Colin's work, like, I'm just still in awe. Like, how do you even follow that? My God. It was amazing, but, when you see that there, people in Britain, people in the South need to realise that there is major scars there, major scars. And cross-border collaboration needs to involve an element of education around that. And that leads me on nicely to a massive gap at the minute, I suppose because it's quite new, talking about legacy and how we deal with victims and survivors. And again, Britain passing this legacy bill that kind of says, draw a line under it. that's so far removed from the ground. And that's kind of saying to people that, like, as Colin said, their loved ones don't matter, which is really, really sad. And I bring back the point as well that Eileen said about, ex-prisoners, paramilitaries, all that. I was in a room recently where I brought up the point, because you were bringing up the good, the bad, and the ugly of the Good Friday Agreement. And I brought up the point that, for a lot of people, it's still a sore point that prisoners were released, let alone the fact that history is not being explored. And I had one person come over to me afterwards and shake my hand, but in a really narky way. And he was like, how you doing? I'm the ugly part of the Good Friday Agreement. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, I should not have raised that point. Like, I really hurt his feelings. But you know what? When I was reflecting on it this morning and what Eileen had said, I was thinking, well, I really admire that he was in that room and having those conversations and all, and I admire people who have transformed and get involved in these processes. But at the end of the day, if there was many people going through the conflict and they didn't choose to lift a gun or to do anything like that, and many women were trying to keep households whilst their husbands or partners or whatever were in prison, and they were supposedly the heroes, So I just think there's a lot of the narrative that's been left out, and when we think cross-border working, we shouldn't be thinking solely about economic development. And I know economically cross-border education strategies and things like that might work out well, but it's there shouldn't be money as an agenda when it comes to something so raw and so personal and that impacts so many individuals. I just think it really needs to go down to the grassroots, because people are getting on with things every day. Stormont's not running, which means that the North-South Ministerial Council's not running, which means that the high level of things cross-border aren't really operating for me or you or my cousin or, day-to-day working class people are struggling, and the conversations cross-border at the moment are being had amongst policymakers and government and things like that. But you see, whenever I look at the people that I work with, like, I'm just thinking, wee Mary who was getting her cancer treatment, like, who's looking after her, really?
You see, you raise a really important point, Kyra, because then how do you, even that thing about understanding, so the South understanding what we've been through, from a community perspective, do you have any examples of where you do see the cross-border work, community working has actually helped, or that have you got ideas for cross-border community work that you think would actually help to move this forward? But because, as you say, it's on the ground that that it starts to matter, and we could hear that this morning just from particularly Eileen in terms of what she does.
Yeah, we received funding recently from the International Fund for Ireland again, which is actually very good at recognising the grassroots in all of these conversations. And it's called Better Together, and we have sort of identified key themes that cross the border between Derry and immediate border communities like Calais, Lifford, Buncrana. So some of the things we're doing is like working with the Pink Ladies Cancer Support to look at the impact of chemicals in food and beauty products and stuff in causing cancer. We are doing allotment projects to try and bring people back to local food and the whole pesticides issue and all of that. I think it's really important to highlight too at this point that a lot of cross-border stuff seems to be, kind of like the hand being held out by either Britain or Ireland to Northern Ireland as like the poor cousin. But I think that an innovative thing about this project is it shows that like Northern Ireland, we have something to offer. Yeah. And people can learn from us. So like in this program, we're building the capacity of these really small organizations, because in Northern Ireland, because of what we've been through, our community sector had to develop and be strong and powerful on its own. And in the south, there's not that legislation to support really small groups. So if we can support those small groups, there's something to be learned from us. Another issue that we identified after the fact, actually, with this program was that the South, with the influx of refugees and asylum seekers, is really struggling to come to terms with, culture and assimilating these people in integration. And that's something that at our wee project in Derry, we had to deal with in our own interface area. And the way we done it was we kind of tried to introduce like difference as a celebration. So one year we had like a big Mela event in the sort of no-go zone between Bishop Street and the Fountain. And the idea was that you were reclaiming that space, normalising the use of it, and celebrating these newcomers that were being perceived as a threat, and as a result were the victims of hate crime. So recently, actually last weekend, we brought a busload of refugees and asylum seekers from Buncrana up to another little border community that we're working with called Calais, and seeing those kids that hadn't been out of the centre that they're staying in because of the intimidation that they're getting in Buncrana actually be welcomed in a different village was really, really amazing. And some of these people actually cooked their local cuisine from home, and everybody was trying it, and they were trying on the different costumes and stuff. And it's just like, that's a really safe way of doing things. It's very grassroots. Like, it's not gonna, like, it's not gonna end up in like a big, huge, massive bridge that connects the one side of the foil with the other, like, but going back to that whole how do you measure impact thing, you can't measure something like that. That was just priceless.
Yeah, and maybe sometimes you shouldn't have to. I think that's the problem. Sometimes we're being forced to try and measure things that as you say, can't be measured. It's interesting because what you're saying is that, rather than the kind of getting them together, but you use other ways of other issues to bring them together, and then so it's not front and center. It's about trying to connect communities. It's just the fact that things in common that you work with them together to try and resolve.
Definitely, but I would say that yes, it's coming more to the fore that you need to identify common issues and work on them. But I would say do not brush under the carpet the difficult things like the border pool and the identity and the paramilitary activity and things like that, because to do that is, it's kind of fooling ourselves, and it's just pushing things down the road, which we're all very, very good at in Northern Ireland. I just think as well that you need to explore the fact that identity is now individual. Yeah. With globalization and things like that, identity is not orange and green. It's everything. People are a mix. People are not one or the other.
It's funny, you just reflect on Peter's role, because I was saying to Peter, I watched RTA a couple of weeks ago, and they did a piece on first day school for P1s. And it was a particular national school, and they had 36 nationalities in primary one. I mean, it was so lovely. You just saw all these beautiful faces, bouncing with happiness to go into P1 with 36 nationalities. And work I'm doing at the minute in Clare, in County Clare, one town, 2 and 3 people in the town weren't born in Ireland. The diversity in Ireland now, I don't even think there's an appreciation, just particularly in some parts, of how diverse a place it is. And that kind of leads me on to Peter and the whole it's just interesting in the context of integrated education, but it's obviously something that's front and center for Peter. So just to bring you in on that point around, the fact that we haven't really made much progress in integrated education, and what as we would like. So what do you think's behind that, or just if you could explain something of the background to that?
Sure. Kyra's work is fantastic, by the way. The Guardian newspaper brought out a short film yesterday, so Google The Guardian and the real Derry girls taking down a peace wall. That's Kyra and her colleagues, and it's a fantastic short film, if you don't mind me.
Please don't.
It's a really good question, because we had a discussion this morning about whether the Good Friday Agreement has delivered, and in some ways it has, and in some ways it hasn't. Integrated education is built into the Good Friday Agreement. In 1998, about 4% of children in Northern Ireland went to integrated schools. Today, it's 7 point something percent. So we've had a 3-point increase in the 25 years since the agreement was concluded, which in my eyes is not a good record of having promoted integrated education. But it's on the rise. And with Bangor Academy voting to go integrated, the largest school in Northern Ireland will break the 8% mark, which is a big celebration. We're off 7%, we're going to get the 8%, so long as the department approves the development plan for Bangor Academy, and there'll be some questions if they don't, so hopefully they will. What are the reasons for that? I think you have to go, a brief history explanation, you have to go back a long time in some ways. In the 1830s, 200 years ago, what was then the UK government, which covered Britain and the whole of the island of Ireland, tried to introduce the first stages of primary education onto the island. And the government were saying, we want kids to be educated together. All the churches got together and said, no, we don't. We want to educate the children in our own church setup, in our own church halls. And the government at that stage gave in, and that's what happened in the 1830s. I think one of the big unanswered questions of history for Tim McGarry and David Hume later over dinner, the long and the short of it, might be, what would this island have looked like if the government in the 1830s had held firm and said, no, the children have to be educated together. So that was the start of segregated education on the island. In the 1920s, Lord Londonderry, post-partition, Education Minister in Northern Ireland, said, I want a review. The Lynn Review didn't deliver much. Londonderry wanted to end the segregation. And under pressure from, guess what, all of the churches, and also from politicians, and with an election looming, the then Prime Minister James Craig dropped the review, and basically nothing changed. The segregation continued. And I think this is one of the big issues, actually, as we move forward. We've spent 25 years since the agreement doing a lot of very positive stuff. This place has changed incredibly over the last 25 years. As a native of Belfast, I look at it and it brings tears to my eyes sometimes to see the progress that we've made. It's fabulous. But the big issue for me over the next 25 years is ending segregation in all sorts of ways, not just in education. The peace barriers, the housing. You know, there are as many people living in segregated housing in Belfast and Northern Ireland now as there was when the agreement was signed in 1998. So 94% of social housing is segregated, as it was 25 years ago. We haven't made huge progress in terms of integrated education. And bear in mind, when it started in 1981, the years of the hunger strikes, and some parents had a vision of something different, and they set up the first integrated school at Lagan College. 28 kids went to that school to start with. For those of you who aren't across this or from the south, those kids going into schools, a lot of the days needed police protection, because the general view here was, how dare these children actually from different religious backgrounds be educated together in the same classroom. Police protection to go into school. So that was 28 kids. We now have about 28,000 kids going to the 78% who go to integrated schools. Why is it, sorry, to answer your question, why is it so difficult? I think there are a few reasons. One is you can't break down 200 years of a system overnight. But 25 years on, we should have broken it down more than we should have. Of the nearly 80 integrated schools in Northern Ireland at the minute, every single one of them was set up by parents saying we want this school to be integrated. Not a single school set up by the department. Every one of them by parents saying we want this school to be integrated. So it takes time. The politics has got in the way. There was a huge breakthrough last year when the Assembly passed the Integrated Education Act. Nobody expected it to go through. It did. And that's a significant movement forward, albeit it's not perfect. I think there are issues around policy where it is easier to ignore the need for integrated education. We talked about the Peace Programme earlier. I certainly think the Peace Programme should put more focus on integrated education, not shared education, because shared education in some ways perpetuates some of the division, but is doing some positive work. But let's actually just have kids in the same classroom growing up together wearing the same uniforms, and not with the story that we currently have of so many people like me saying, I didn't meet a Catholic until I was 18. So when 7% are going to integrated schools, 93% aren't, and therefore they're going to schools that are largely segregated where you don't meet somebody from the other background, or if there are people from the other background in your school, they will keep their head down in case they're treated differently or bullied or whatever else, so you don't have meaningful engagement and conversations with them. And I think another reason is I think the department have produced a strategy which they were required to do because of the Integrated Education Act. I think the strategy is really poor. I think it's something we as a charity need to reflect on. It doesn't set targets. Let me give you an example of some of the financial issues. If 20% of parents in a school decide we want the school to go integrated, there is a requirement to have a ballot, independent ballot. If half the parents vote and more than half say integrated, then there's a development plan goes forward to the department. Each one of those ballots costs £10,000. Over the last 2 or 3 years, we've had at least 5 or 6 or 7 schools have those ballots. After the Integrated Education Act was passed, the department that had £20,000 in their budget for those ballots over the last few years per annum, 5, 6, 7 schools each year, cost £10,000 each. They have £20,000 in their budget. The strategy says put enough resource into supporting integrated education. Guess what's in their budget this year? £20,000. And what that says to me is you've got a department that really doesn't want to do this. And part of the reason is because there are 2 main stakeholders, or the control sector and the maintained sector, each of which have 40-odd% of pupils going to schools. And whenever they are your main stakeholders, it's difficult to do things that are different to what is not in their interest or is in their interest. So it's policy, it's systems, it's funding, it's structures, it's tradition. All of those things make it a lot more difficult, and why we haven't grown from 4% to much beyond 7% at the minute.
And the department issue, I'm just trying to think, how can they not commit more to it when there's a strategy? It's like, what is the point of a strategy if you actually don't put the tools in place to implement it? So, that's a bit, is there enough there to kind of, presumably there's enough, you're obviously lobbying on it, but it just always strikes me, a strategy written without actually thinking, well, how are we actually going to go about implementing this? So, that disconnect is a big barrier to trying to move anything on.
Well, and these are really important issues that also go beyond education. So let me give you an example of one of those. We did Ulster University did some research independently of the fund. The fund is a charity, by the way, for those that don't know, that supports integrated education. And that research identified 32 pairs, isolated pairs, as they talked about it. So that's 64 schools in 32 villages in rural areas in Northern Ireland. Those schools were within a mile of each other in these villages. One was maintained, one was controlled, 32 pairs. For those that don't know, maintained largely Catholic, controlled largely Protestant. Of those 32 pairs, 64 schools, 26 of the pairs, so more than 26 schools, were below the threshold for sustainability in a village. And by the way, 42% of our rural schools are below the threshold for sustainability anyway. But in these 64 schools, 26 pairs, there were at least half of them below the threshold for sustainability. Now the question is not will some of these schools eventually close, because they will. The question is, what will that village look like when one or both of them closes? Schools are a really important part of a fabric of a community and a village. So if both close, that's disastrous. If one of those schools closes, what will that village look like in 10 years? So if to shorten it, let's say the Protestant school closes, what happens at the minute through, and it's not acted on with the strategy or with the policy from the department, is a process called area planning, where they're supposed to plan for schools in an area, and you would expect that in that situation the plan would be, one of these schools is going to close, let's see how we can get all the kids from the village to the other school, or integrate the school. That doesn't happen. Area planning basically happens in two different ways. It's a Catholic area planning and a Protestant area planning, to shorten it. And so the planning actually is about how you bus those Protestant kids to the nearest Protestant school. It could be 5, 10, 15 miles away. The consequence for that village is it'll be single identity within 10 or 15 years. And so the lack of planning, the lack of courage, the lack of desire to actually take this issue on is really unhelpful in terms of social issues and cohesion and harmony within villages and within this society, because we are inadvertently supporting continued segregation even in those rural areas. That village will go single identity. Never mind what is calculated as 130 million miles. 130 million miles a year busing children to a school that isn't their closest school.
And even when there
130
was
million miles.
Even when there was ministers in place, it still was there anything at any point that you saw a chink of light to think, yeah, this is moving somewhere, and you know, what might that have been?
There are lots of chinks of lights. I mean, frankly, at times ministers haven't been helpful. So you know, there is a question to be discussed around some of that, but there are. I mean, an Integrated Education Act is now passed. Fantastic. That's a huge positive step forward. While there was some discussion on either side of the community about it, what we have found is that people from both a unionist and a nationalist background are supportive of integrated education, sometimes can't say it publicly as much as they would like to. Consistently, whenever polls are carried out independently, at least 66 and usually over 70% of parents say we want our children to go to integrated schools where they're being brought up together with people from the other side of the community. And the importance of that is, when you're 18, your life pattern's set. If you ask young people from a Protestant or Catholic background, they will play different sports. They will go to different social clubs. They will have different friendship circles. All of what they will go to the British Scouts or they will go to the Irish Scouts. All of their life patterns are set by the time they're 18, and we need to break that. I talk about we're in the middle of a 50-year plus peace process. It will be 50 years and more. 25 years in, it'll take another 25 years at least. And part of the reason I say that is that if we could just go like that and change our education system where kids were integrated and being brought up together in the same school, making friendships, playing the same sports, whatever they may be, wearing the same uniforms, going to a social club, didn't matter whether it was mainly Protestant or Catholic. If we did that, it'll take at least 18 years for them to come out the other side. And that's why this is generational stuff we're involved with, but we need to take the big steps.
Thank you, that's great, thanks Peter. And actually, you pointed to Joel when you talked about young people, so hope he doesn't mind that. And some quite deep questions for you, I think, probably, in terms of your position as an activist, and a very kind of maybe cutting to the quick, the issue has come up this morning around, kind of skirted around the issue of constitutional change, but do you think there will be constitutional change in your lifetime? I'm thinking about that generational issue that Peter brought up.
Yeah, I think one thing that we'll have to be very careful of when talking about constitutional change is falling into this trap of thinking that just means United Ireland in whatever way it's been painted up to this point. Constitutional change could mean a lot of things. I think an interesting way to phrase it would be, do I think that Northern Ireland will stay exactly the same throughout my entire life? And I think the answer is clearly no. And if the answer is clearly no to that one, then that would lean towards, yeah, I think that something will probably change about how here is run or how here is categorised whenever I'm older, but I don't think it should be a priority. One of the concerns that I would have around something like constitutional change is, like, for example, take a border poll. I get that there's a lot of people who really want their version of a New Ireland or United Ireland, whatever kind of way you would like to phrase it. And those people have kind of been told that that's not legitimate opinion for a long time. And, with the Good Friday Agreement, it does give those people a pathway to achieve their goals. But I would imagine, and from engaging with Republicans, there is still a frustration, that it's taken this long to be treated seriously. And so I sympathise, I do sympathise with people going, well, if now isn't the time, when is? How long is it that you expect us to wait? And I think I get that, and I get why it probably doesn't sound too good. Someone like me, coming from a unionist background, asking someone who does want constitutional change to just hold off a little bit longer. But at the same time, I think that it would be a good idea to learn some of the lessons of Brexit. So we should probably have some degree of stability here before we look to changing it. We should probably have a little bit more self-sufficiency. I don't think it's good for us to just be a big black hole in some government's budget, or red hole, I suppose it would be. But yeah, I think that those are the kinds of things that we should be looking at first, so that whenever a border poll does happen, if it was to come back in the affirmative for constitutional change, Ireland's not inheriting or that new state wouldn't be inheriting all of the problems of the North. At least then, our problems have been addressed, and we'd have a relative degree of true peace. Because I think there's a misunderstanding that we got peace after the Good Friday Agreement. I have never felt like we've been at peace. I felt like we've very much still been at war, minus the bombs and the bullets. People's mindsets are still very much in a mode that looks for enemies and that looks for others. And that to me tells me that in some people's brains there is still a war going on. And so it's I think step one, before we look 25 years into the future, 55 years into the future, whatever, step one is just kind of putting a breaker on it, getting everyone to evaluate where we're at, getting a bit of stability. It'd be good not to have to worry about a government collapsing in another however many years. Once we address these things, then we can start to kind of have a real public conversation about what are the things people want, what are the things people want to see, and then who knows how long that'll take. I think a really good thing to ask, people always say, what is it going to look like in 50 years, or what is it going to look like in 25 years? I would say, have a think about what you want Ireland to look like in 500 years or 1,000 years after all this is long behind us. What do we want us to look like when we don't have to address issues of legacy, or whenever we don't have to address political instability? After all this is said and done, fast forward 500 years, what does that look like? Because once we have a clear idea of what that looks like, we can start now to kind of craft a society that looks a bit more like that, so that when that time comes, we are close, rather than looking back to the past and going, well, we don't want to do this, we don't want to make these mistakes, we don't want this to happen again. Look 500 years into the future, what do you want to happen, and start kind of pushing in that direction rather than running from that direction.
You have conversations with, I'm going to call it, I was trying to think of the right expression, the other side, if that's the way of putting it. So, and your young people, what are your conversations like beyond, obviously, the politics of this place? Thinking, back to Peter's point that if you were integrated from the start in primary school, things might look a lot different. What are the things that you have in common when you start to chat?
It's really interesting because for me, I did, whenever I was younger, I had certain political opinions, and then I had a kind of revelation moment where everything kind of flipped, and I started to talk to a lot of people that I never would have used to, and some of those people would be from very unfortunate backgrounds and things, and whenever I'm talking to them, I notice that young people are living in a completely different world altogether from sort of our politicians and our leaders. And I'm glad Lagan was mentioned, because I've got a really good example of this with using Lagan. So one of the guys I know, he's from a unionist area, but probably wouldn't call himself a unionist. He's just kind of, it's by circumstance rather than by choice. And he went to Lagan, and he has a group of 5 or 6 mates that he would talk to, and they're from different countries. Some of them have moved here, they weren't born here. Different backgrounds. Some of them are Republicans, some of them are nationalists, some of them are apolitical. And what I notice is that his version of peace, he exists in that little environment in peace with others, but they do it in a way that a politician would insist is a problem. And so you might have 5 or 6 lads around a table, and the Catholics are calling the Protestants Huns, and the Huns are calling the Catholics Fenians, but they're all laughing and enjoying the whatever it is that they're doing. Yeah. And what's been really funny, because I've said this a few times, and usually after these events I'll get like some older people coming up and saying, actually, like, that's been my experience too. So I think sometimes here in Northern Ireland we have this nasty habit of creating problems that don't exist. I think I was talking a few years ago to a guy, and we were talking about this idea that maybe the role isn't to bring peace here, it's to convince people that it's kind of already here. But yeah, I would argue against that now, because I do think the mindsets are still a bit behind. But one of the criticisms of integrated education that I heard from, I think it was Diane Dawson, which was really interesting, was that a school like hers, does have people from all sorts of backgrounds. It will be skewed in one direction because of where it is, but it very much is an environment where you can go and you're not in an echo chamber. You're mingling with people from different backgrounds. But officially, she is an integrated school. Braniel Primary School. I think I don't want to be misquoting her. I hope it is Diane that I was talking to about this. But yeah, so it's not officially integrated, and because it isn't officially integrated, it can have an effect on our funding and things. More funding, I think, goes to integrated schools. No, there's some issue with not having that official label that she kind of took issue with, that I thought was interesting. And to me, that kind of says it's not that there's a problem with integration, but maybe some kind of reevaluation needs to be done in terms of what do we consider an integrated school, how does a school become integrated, these kind of things. But overall, I mean, absolutely, if kids are growing up together, if they're sharing each other's experience growing up, if they're part of each other's childhoods, if they're part of each other's memories, you don't get that hostility and vitriol towards each other. You just don't get it.
It's interesting because I know you and I have kind of batted forward in questions, but I thought this was a great one in the sense of the typical conversation. So, you said we often hear the question, will unionists be accommodated in New Ireland? And you were saying if you were in charge, how would you make remaining in the union or appealing for nationalists and Republicans?
Yeah, I think this is something that unionism doesn't talk about enough. And whenever I started to talk to Republicans and nationalists and others, one of the big kind of things I got is you shouldn't be talking to them. By talking to them, you're legitimizing their position, etc., etc. And it's so unbelievably idiotic to me, because I'm going, if you have a pool of people who support the union, that pool can't get bigger unless you approach people that aren't already in that pool. And so you have to engage with people who don't agree with your position. You simply have to, if you ever want to grow your movement or your cause. And part of that would mean unionists having conversations about, okay, we have a population here who not only feel unhappy with the constitutional arrangement, feel offended by the current constitutional arrangement. Some of them may be traumatized because of events that went on during the Troubles. A lot of people that I've spoke to have a real, and I'm going to use the word anti-Britishness, but I don't think it's anti-Britishness in a hostile way. I think it's anti-Britishness in a sense of we associate a lot of the bad things that happen to us in our communities with the British, and so we want to get as far away from that as we can. We just have no interest in that identity. And what my job as a unionist is to try and work out a way to reconcile that. So to say to people who would want a New Ireland, what is it exactly about this arrangement that you don't like? And they might list their reasons, and then we would talk about those reasons. And then they might say, I really don't like how the health services run for some reason. But I would then talk about that, and you would go, okay, well, what would your health service look like? I don't like the school system. Well, what would your school system look like? You can have really productive conversations with each other, but at the heart of it is taking people seriously. So if you're a unionist, it's not doing someone a favour, or it's not ticking a box to talk with the other side. It's treating them very seriously. It's a legitimate position to want Ireland to be unified. We agreed to that. People seem to forget that we agreed to that. That is what we decided to play. This is the road that we decided to take, was that we're going to live in a country where there are large portions of people who completely disagree about the direction that they want to go. If we're going to do that, we're going to need to work out ways to accommodate each other. I think one of the big things that unionists should, in my opinion, concede is things around the Irish language. You don't have to go back too far before you start seeing in history, before you start finding big unionist figures that were fluent Irish speakers or that were proud Irish speakers. That to me is one issue where we're really shooting ourselves in the foot by trying to play this politics game with it. I don't know if how many unionists there are in here or whatever, but whenever you start to talk to people like Irish speakers, you start to very quickly realise that you had an idea in your head of who these people were and why they wanted what they wanted. And through talking to them, you start to kind of realize that a lot of that isn't true. And I think in the constitutional debate, it's the same thing. Up till a few years ago, I was fully under the understanding that the call for a United Ireland was a call for Northern Ireland to just join the Republic. And as I talk to my peers, I still find that that's a misconception that is very widespread. This idea that nationalists just want Northern Ireland to join the Republic and assume everything that goes on down there and kind of just plug ourselves into their system. I don't think I've ever met one Republican who has pitched that kind of scenario. So it's really funny to me that in our own communities, whenever we're in our own little echo chambers, we have all of these ideas about the other side, and it's just so tragic that it all takes is a 5-minute conversation with someone to kind of say, holy crap, you aren't out to destroy me and my family.
Yeah. When are you going to be First Minister then, or Deputy First Minister?
When you all vote for me.
You need to go into politics then. So, listen, I'm just conscious of time, and I think our time is up. So, it was just open to the floor in terms of any questions that you might have for the panel today.
I'd vote for him anyway. Definitely.
No, I think we're okay. I'm going to briefly end by just saying, and Peter's already said his would be an integrated education, but he can have another one. But if you're going to do one action to each of you, you know, if there's going to be one action you would do to try and move things forward at the minute, and then maybe it's a bit of a hard question, but you know, what would that one action be? If you were going to do one thing to drive forward kind of better kind of integration of society here.
You know, it's going to seem really silly, but picnics.
Very
Picnics.
good. Picnics in the park.
Think oftentimes we like to overcomplicate things, but you know, you put 3 loyalists on one side of a blanket and 3 Republicans on the other side and give them unlimited sandwiches and beers. I'm telling you, they'll walk out of that better friends than any government program or committee that you could design. Picnics.
That's brilliant. Good. Thank you, Orla.
Do you know, I should be shutting my mouth here because I just have learned an awful lot from you. I've learned a lot. I have a lot to go home and think about. And to some extent, it probably, listening to you there, it's not the border, it's all the palaver around it. You know, I just began thinking, we're a member of a European University Alliance. We've partners in Portugal and in Spain and other countries, and particularly the Portuguese and Spanish partners. They're on either side of their border. And I don't know how much angst and how much goes on around worrying about their border. It's there, and they get on with life around it. And I suppose from my point of view, you know, trying to normalize the fact that, look, at the borders there, but let's get on with our work regardless and try and bring people together. You know, I've had this kind of idea about student entrepreneurship where, you know, you support students in an entrepreneurship manner, you know, starting their own business, but you bring them together then. You know, picnics can be added to the list of things that they would do together, and to just focus on something else, and just trying to live in a normal sort of a fashion. Okay. What I would, one last point just to make, Kyra, is, you know, some of what you spoke about really resonated with me, but a long time ago when I was in Cork, in the art college as it happens, and we had an art therapy program, and the 2 biggest international partners were in Belfast and South Africa, and there were, you know, areas where societies had suffered deep trauma, and there is a need. The arts were, you know, and Colin's role here earlier on, but I think there are many ways through the arts and through, you know, social activities that we can also support as a university.
Kyra?
Well, I kind of came up with 2 things.
Right.
So I'm going to say them
very
quickly.
quickly, because
So-
Anthony will definitely be having
Okay, so firstly, I have a group of women, 170 women in a hen shed in Derry, and I'd probably put them all into Stormont and tell them to run the place. And secondly, I would get everybody in this room to write down who they are and see how many people on the table have done some of the same things.
Okay, thank you. Peter?
I was going to say a whole lot of things, but I can't then, or
No.
Anthony will have my guts for daughter. So a few years ago, 5 or 6, 7 years ago, as you get older, these things are, you get it wrong. It's maybe more than that, I don't know, but I think it's 5 or 6 years ago. I went down to look at the Citizens' Assembly operating in Dublin. It was talking about the environment. Before I did, I went and had a meeting with the lady who was in charge of them. She was seconded from the Taoiseach's office along with the team. And I said to her, gosh, it's a really fascinating model. You must get queries from all over the world about the solutions you've been able to find around, in the South case, the referendum around reproductive rights and same-sex marriage and so on. Because politicians wouldn't handle those issues. And she said, yeah, we've had inquiries from Korea and we've had inquiries from this country and South America and all sorts of other countries she mentioned. And I said to her, well, what about 60 miles up the road where we're having some difficulties ourselves? No, nobody has come down and talked to us. Nobody has even made a phone call to us. And I'm thinking, that's incredible, actually, when you look at what they've been able to achieve in that model and solving issues that politicians find too difficult to solve, and then going out to the electorate, to the people who vote, and say, what do you think? And the people said, yeah, we don't want to be held back by too great a restriction around abortion and reproductive rights. Yeah, there should be same-sex marriage. And in some ways, if you forgive me as a northerner, Ireland really expressed its voice of saying, we want to be part of 21st century Europe here. We're not living in the past anymore. Thank you very much. So what would I change? If the Assembly comes back, I would make some sort of system within it which creates a series of citizens' assemblies that have to be linked into government. No point in having them on their own. In the South, the Taoiseach's office ran it, and they reported back to the Dáil, and the Dáil, through committees, then took it through to referenda. And that's what we need here, where we need people to be part of the process of solving the difficult issues. Because let me tell you, you see the issues that are on the table at the minute that are difficult. If you ask the people, the civil society, the folks that we've heard from today, but everybody else living in the normal houses and social houses and all sorts of other places, they'll find an answer because they want to move forward to make us 21st century European city, whether within the EU or not. I'm not talking about that. We want to be a 21st. So that's the process that I would have.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much. And thanks to you all. I think I'll be smiling about the picnic now for the next few days. But it's a great discussion and much appreciated for your time. Thank you.